The colonial rule in the countryside of Bengal, Jharkhand and Bombay. The colonial rule in India came into existence in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey. It had a great impact not only on the political aspect of India, but also on those who lived in the countrysides of this subcontinent. We come to know about this rule and its administration through the zamindars of Bengal and in the west from Bombay Deccan. In the regions of the Rajmahal hills lived the Paharias and the Santals. The British rule in these countryside tell us about the company's various administrative measures, different oppressive revenue collection policies, and their impact on the people living in these countrysides. Let's first start with Bengal. The Burdwan Raj was a zamindari estate that flourished from about 1657 to 1956, first under the Mughals and then under the British in the province of Bengal in India. It was during the era of Tilak Chand Ray that the British East India Company acquired Bengal in 1757 in the Battle of Plassey. The outcome of the battle was that though the Diwani rights of Bengal remained with the Raja, but revenue collection was directly governed by the British. This in turn resulted in direct control on the zamindars. With the Treaty of Allahabad signed on in 1765 between the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II and Lord Clive of the British East India Company, even the Diwani rights or right to administer the territory of Bengal were granted to the East India Company. With the reign of administration in their hands, the British India Company in 1793 introduced new revenue policy under the Permanent Settlement Act of Bengal. The objective of the settlement were dealing with rural crisis which started arising in Bengal due to famine and droughts. Officials felt that this could be dealt by encouraging the state to make investment in agriculture and trade. The company believed that by introducing the policy of fixed revenue would motivate the zamindars to invest in the land as they would be sure of earning a profit from their investments. This in turn would lead to continuous flow of revenue to the company. At the same time, it would also create a new social class of landlords who would remain loyal to the British rule. Thus, this settlement was made with the Rajas and Talukdars of Bengal. They were now classified as zamindars who had to collect and pay the revenue of their estates that was fixed in perpetuity. The zamindar collected rent from different villages under their dominance, paid the revenue to the company, and retained the difference as his income. He was expected to pay the company regularly, failing which his estate could be auctioned. The outcome of this settlement was an auction of the estates of Burdwan's Raja in 1797, and by the end of the 18th century, over 75% of the zamindars were auctioned under the Settlement Act. Why zamindars defaulted on payments? The initial amount of revenue demanded by the company was set arbitrarily at an unreasonable figure, as the company felt it would never be able to claim a share of increased income from land when prices rose and cultivation expanded. This high demand was imposed in the 1790s at a time when the prices of agricultural produce were depressed, making it difficult for the ryots to pay their dues to the zamindar. The zamindars also were unable to pay the allotted revenue. The impact of the permanent settlement on both ryots and zamindars were the revenue was invariable regardless of the harvest and had to be paid punctually, making the lives of ryots miserable as they were overburdened with debts which they borrowed from moneylenders to pay the tax. The permanent settlement limited the power of the zamindars to only as revenue collectors. The company further subdued their authority by disbanding their troops, abolishing their customs duties, and their courts were brought under the supervision of a collector appointed by the company. The zamindars lost their power to organize local justice and the local police. This severely restricted their control on their subjects. Sometimes bad harvests and low prices made payment of dues difficult for the ryots. At other times, ryots deliberately delayed payments. Rich ryots and village headmen, the jotedars and mandals, were only too happy to see the zamindar in trouble. The rise of the jotedars or rich ryots. While many zamindars were facing a crisis at the end of the 18th century, a group of rich peasants that is jotedars or haroladars or grantidars or mandals were consolidating their position in the villages. By the mid of 19th century, jotedars had acquired vast areas of land and controlled local trade as well as money lending, thus exercising immense power over the poorer cultivators of the region. Their lands were cultivated by the poor ryots who handed over half the produce to the jotedars after the harvest. Over the time, within the village, the jotedars became more powerful than zamindars, who often lived in urban areas, unlike the jotedars who were located in the villages. They fiercely resisted efforts by zamindars to increase the jama of the village, prevented zamindari officials from executing their duties, mobilized ryots who were dependent on them, and deliberately delayed payments of revenue to the zamindar. In fact, when the estates of the zamindars were auctioned for failure to make revenue payment, jotedars were often amongst the purchasers. By the beginning of the 19th century, the jotedars, along with village headmen, were emerging as commanding figures in the rural provinces of Bengal. Their rise inevitably weakened zamindari authority. How the zamindars resisted this settlement? The authority of the zamindars in rural areas, however, did not collapse completely. Faced with an exorbitantly high revenue demand and possible auction of their estates, they devised ways of surviving the pressures. Fictitious sale was one such strategy, along with Benami purchases, which was the common practice. In case of the Raja of Burdwan, he transferred some of his zamindari to his mother, since the company had decreed that the property of women would not be taken over. Then, during their auction of Burdwan estates, his agents bought the property by outbidding other purchasers. By the beginning of the 19th century, the depression in prices was over. Thus, those zamindars who had survived the troubles of the 1790s consolidated their power. Rules of revenue payment were also made somewhat flexible. As a result, the zamindars' power over the villages was strengthened. It was only during the Great Depression of the 1930s that they finally collapsed and the jotedars consolidated their power in the countryside. What was the fifth report? Many of the changes we are discussing were documented in detail in a report that was submitted to the British Parliament in 1813. It was the fifth of a series of reports on the administration and activities of the East India Company in India. Often referred to as the fifth report, it contained petitions of zamindars and ryots and reports of collectors from different districts, statistical tables on revenue returns, and notes on the revenue and judicial administration of Bengal and Madras. From the time the company established its rule in Bengal in the mid-1760s, its activities were closely watched and debated in England. Britain were keen to open up the Indian market for British manufacturers. Many political groups argued that the conquest of Bengal was benefiting only the East India Company, but not the British nation as a whole. Information about company misrule and maladministration was hotly debated in Britain, and incidents of the greed and corruption of company officials were widely publicized in the press. Thus, the British Parliament passed a series of acts in the late 18th century to regulate and control company rule in India. It forced the company to produce regular reports on the administration of India and appointed committees to inquire into the affairs of the company. The fifth report was one such report produced by a select committee. It became the basis of intense parliamentary debates on the nature of the East India Company's rule in India. The evidence contained in the fifth report is invaluable for understanding the history of colonial rule in rural Bengal. They indicate that, intent on criticizing the maladministration of the company, and exaggerated the collapse of traditional zamindari power. But zamindars were not always displaced, given the ingenious methods they used to retain their zamindars. Let's now move from Bengal to the countryside of present-day Jharkhand, where we will learn more about the British regressive policies on the regions which practiced shifting agriculture. In the early 19th century, Francis Buchanan, a surveyor from East India Company, travelled through the Rajmahal Hills, which is in present-day Jharkhand. Buchanan's journal gives us tantalizing glimpses of these hill folk in the early 19th century. Now, a brief introduction about the people residing in these hills. They were known as Paharias, and their main livelihood depended on forest produce and shifting cultivation. They cleared patches of forest which had potash-rich soil and grew a variety of pulses and millet for their consumption. They scratched the ground lightly with hoes, cultivated the cleared land for a few years, then left it fallow so that it could recover its fertility and move to a new area. Paharias used various forest produce both for their own consumption and for commercial purposes. Some of the produce was mahua, a flower for food, silk cocoons and resin for sale, and wood for charcoal production, and the patches of grass that covered the lands provided pasture for cattle. Thus the life of the Paharias as hunters, shifting cultivators, food gatherers, charcoal producers, silkworm rearers was completely connected to the forest. They lived in hutments within tamarind groves and followed strict norms within their tribal group, which were maintained by their chief. Any outside intrusion were looked upon with hostility. They often raided the other tribes and agriculturists living in plains either for survival and to assert their supremacy on other communities. This also helped them in building political relations with outsiders. Regular tribute was given to the tribal chiefs by the zamindars to prevent his estate from these raids. The traders too gave a small amount in lieu of seeking the permission to use the hill passes for their trade, which were controlled by Paharias. Intrusion of British officials. This peaceful pact between the three communities broke down in the last decades of the 18th century when the frontiers of settled agriculture were being aggressively extended in eastern India by the British form their expansion policy. Thus the forests were cleared and zamindars and jotedars turned uncultivated lands into rice fields. The officials also repressively followed this policy of clearing forest with the objective of subduing the powers of the tribal community and bringing them under control of the company. The repercussion of these regressive policies were, it sharpened the conflict between hill folk and settled cultivators. The former began to raid settled villages with increasing regularity, carrying away their food grains and cattle. In the 1770s, the British embarked on a brutal policy of extermination, hunting the Paharias down and killing them. This bloodshed was, however, stopped in 1780s by Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur, who proposed a policy of pacification. According to this policy, the Paharias chiefs were given an annual allowance and were responsible for maintaining order in their localities and were to discipline their own people in favor of the company rule. However, many Paharias chiefs refused the allowances, and those who accepted most often lost authority within the community as they were considered traitors. Over a period of time, the Paharias withdrew deep into the mountains, insulating themselves from hostile forces and carrying on a war with outsiders. For them, every white man was the destroyer of their life and was set to snatch away the base of their survival by taking control on their forest and lands. Another imminent danger came in the form of Santals, who with the help of British were infiltrating in the forest and cutting them for cultivating rice and cotton. Cotton was the important crop for exports. As the lower hills were taken over by Santals settlers, the Paharias further receded deeper into the Rajmahal hills and continued their fight of survival with British, but soon were left as small, secluded group. Restricted by Santals from moving down to the lower hills, they were confined to the dry, barren and rocky upper hills. This severely affected their lives as the shifting agriculture depended on the ability to move to newer and newer land. But the most fertile soils became inaccessible to them, thus hampering their mode of cultivation. Thus we understand that Britishers in their drive to collect more revenues made the lives of both zamindars and peasants more complicated, and in the latter case it was miserable too. We will learn more about the peasantry revolts against British Raj in our next video. We will find out the reason for the Santals revolt and similar rebel in Bombay Deccan. We will also look into how Rayotwari system, collection of land revenue and other policies of British Raj completely destroyed the lives of peasants. Key points to remember. The permanent settlement in Bengal in 1793 categorized the Rajas and kings as zamindars and collectors of revenue on behalf of East India Company. The impact of the settlement was auction of several zamindari estate and heavy burden of taxes on peasants, rise of rich peasantry class. The Paharias, the original dwellers of Rajmahal Hills, practiced shifting agriculture and used forest produce for their consumption and commercially. The British officials intruded the hills in late 18th century with the intention of expansion in agriculture, which meant clearance of forests. British officials wanted to convert the Paharias as settled cultivators and grow crops commercially viable for them and which yielded increased revenue for them. The Paharias resisted, which resulted in a revolt in which they were brutally crushed.